Hello and welcome back to another GiantSlayerTV Synergies tier list video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S all the way down to the C tier for patch 11.15. This is the first tier list for the mid set, and with it comes a B patch. Since players need time to figure out the changes, some of our tier list will be speculation. That said, there's enough data for us to have a firm idea of what's doing well and what's not. With all that said, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our tier list, we have the synergies in the S tier, which consists of Cavaliers, Sentinels, Revenant, Mystic, and Ironclad. These traits are doing the best in the meta in terms of consistency. They're used often and are usually parts of winning boards. At the top of the S tier, we have Cavaliers. Before we get into what makes this trait good, yes, it is being nerfed in the B patch, specifically Hecarim and Sejuani. We can only speculate how much this will impact the meta, but Cavaliers may drop down a bit in value after those nerfs. That said, they've had such a large impact on the meta that they deserve a spot in this tier. Basically, the Cavaliers are the best frontline you can have between Hecarim boards, Sejuani early game, and Rel at any point in the game. Slap a Bramble Vest on Hecarim and he isn't dying, at least pre-nerfs. Sejuani gaining Brawler increased her value during the early stages of the game by a lot, and Rel, well, we all know Rel is amazing. Sentinels are one of the newly added traits of the mid set, and they're doing quite well. Early game, they've become one of the best opening boards, thanks largely due to Olaf and Aurelia both having the traits Sentinel and Skirmisher. Of course, Aurelia is also being nerfed in the B patch, so we may see the trait lose a bit of value. Later on in the game, we've seen Lucian become a solid 4-cost carry utilizing 3 or 6 Sentinel. Galio is a strong frontliner, and Pyke has found value in multiple compositions thanks to being an assassin with CC. All in all, the trait has been so far a big success in the meta. Another noteworthy frontline trait is Revenant. Revenant was already a top tier trait thanks to Ivern and Volibear, but now they've also added Fiddlesticks. This means you can have a 3 Revenant frontline for practically any comp. They have good CC, damage, and come back to life. What more could you really want from a frontline? Oh, and Nocturne is back in the meta as a carry, so there is that as well for Revenant. And our last 2 S tier traits are, as usual, Mystic and Ironclad. As far as splash traits go, these are just the best of the best. You can easily tailor your composition to what the lobby is playing. Heavy AD, Ironclad. AP, Mystic. A simple concept and quite easy to splash either of these traits into any mid to late game board. Let's now move on to the A tier. This tier consists of Nightbringer, Assassin, Forgotten, Abomination, Ranger, Brawler, Inanimate, and Caretaker. These traits are used frequently in the meta, though they may not be quite as strong as the S tier traits. They're still some of the best. Up first is Nightbringer. Nightbringer has bounced back into the meta after looking quite weak at the start of the mid set. Yasuo has returned as a carry, largely in part due to his true damage to fight frontline builds like Cavaliers. Thalios is an actual reliable carry now after the change they did to his ability. And they buffed Diana quite a lot to make up for her losing Dragon Slayer. All in all, Nightbringer is a solid synergy to use in multiple ways. Assassins are doing well despite losing both Katarina and LeBlanc. The reason for their success is entirely thanks to Nocturne and Revenant. It's quite easy to put together a 4 Assassin and 4 Revenant composition, which buffs up Nocturne quite a bit. Radiant items are also quite good for Nocturne, whether it's a Radiant Runins, Deathblade, or Last Whisper. In addition to Nocturne, Pyke adds value with the stun, and Diana was buffed, so you have a good amount of CC with an Assassin board. Combine all of this together, and you've got a solid A tier trait. Forgotten is a trait that we may see fall down quite a bit in value once the B patch nerfs work their way into the meta. Both Hecarim and Misfortune are being nerfed, and they're the main reason as to why the trait is doing well. This is due to the Cavalier reroll composition that we see utilizes Hecarim 3 and Misfortune 3. We won't know if the specific build is dead in the water until players have had time to fully explore the changes, but it will certainly be weaker. Without that composition, the only other way to play Forgotten is with Draven, and even then that relies on Hecarim, so keep an eye out for where Forgotten lands in the meta. Abomination got immediately nerfed at the beginning of the mid set with a hotfix that changed the monstrosity from being an auto-attacking monster to being more of a tank that punches softly. After a bit of time, we've seen this synergy come back up in the meta and is slightly above the middle of the pack. It's good early game, gets some value mid game, and falls off in the late game unless you've got an emblem. Up next, we have Rangers. Rangers actually got a lot better in the mid-set despite losing Kindred. This is because Aphelios is a consistent carry now, and they added action, who provides a lot of late-game power. That said, for the most part, you really only see 2 Ranger, as 4 is just not quite worth it to play. But at least Rangers are doing well, specifically Aphelios in action. Brawlers lost Warwick but gained Sejuani, which is arguably a better trade-off. Having a 3-trait 2 cost to add in with your Brawlers opens up a lot of possibilities, increasing the overall value of the trait. But besides that, not much has changed. Brawlers are still amazing during the early stages of the game, and not all that great later on. Next is another one of the new traits, Inanimate. This trait is only on Gwen and makes Gwen quite valuable in the meta. The reason is that you can protect your backline quite well with the damage reduction zone Inanimate provides, though it is only for 8 seconds. Overall, Gwen is in a good place within the meta. And lastly, for the A tier, we have Caretaker, also known as Heimerdinger. Heimer is doing quite well for himself in the meta as a solid late game carry option. The issue, as always, is getting to that late game to hit Heimerdinger too. Plus, without some type of mana item or multiple invokers, he's barely able to get off 1 cast per fight. Basically, he's a bit of a diva when it comes to what you need for him to do well, but when you get all those pieces together, he's an amazing carry. Let's now move into the B tier. This tier consists of Hellion, Cruel, Skirmishers, Cannoneer, Draconic, Invoker, Victorious, Dawnbringer, and Redeemed. These are slightly weaker traits than A tier, but still have a place in the meta. Up first is Hellion. Hellions are interesting now that they're a 2-4-6-8 trait, as splashing them in is a lot easier. They also gained Tristana, a viable carry that they were lacking before. All in all, Hellions have somehow become even more niche than they were before, but are still relevant in the meta nonetheless. Speaking of Hellions, next we have Cruel, meaning Teemo. Teemo is the same as ever, except his Hellion clone now actually works with the Cruel trait. But other than that, not much has changed for Teemo. Still good late game, but still difficult to play for most players since he costs health. It may seem odd seeing Skirmishers in the B tier when Aurelia and Olaf have been hard carrying the early game. But that's where Skirmishers do the best in the early stages of the game. Sure, you might occasionally see a late game Skirmisher board, but Jax doesn't quite cut it as a main carry compared to a lot of other carries. So yes, Skirmishers are fantastic in stages 2 and 3, but after that they tend to fall flat. Cannoneer is new, but weird. Weird because we see it used often thanks to Lucian and Senna as well as Tristana. But this trait, while played often, doesn't seem to matter all that much. Lucian doesn't need it to carry, neither does Tristana. This Fortune isn't an auto attacker, same with Senna. So while we see Cannoneer in quite a few compositions, it doesn't really have that much of an impact overall. Draconic. Prior to the hotfix, this may have been in the S tier. Now it's roughly where it's always been. Yes, 5 Draconic is easier to hit with Galio, but the issue, the same issue it's always had, is consistency. You need the trait early to gain value from it, and even then you have to high roll larger eggs. There's so much variance with Draconic that it can go from being an S tier trait one game to a C tier the next. Invokers aren't doing all that poorly, but with Karma being, well, kinda bad, we're not seeing this trait used nearly as often as it was before. It really only comes into play with Heimerdinger boards late game. Due to the lack of use, Invokers are down in the B tier for now. Say goodbye to God King and hello to Victorious. It's the new and shiny trait that Garen has in the mid set, and honestly, it's quite good. The damage it brings is quite noticeable, albeit only to one champion at a time. But AP compositions aren't doing all that well right now, same with Dawnbringer, so Garen doesn't quite have a place in the current meta. Speaking of them, Dawnbringers are on the struggle bus. Sure, early game they do well, and Nidalee is a great early game carry, but late game? They're almost completely absent from the meta. A large reason is because Karma isn't doing well. Turns out they may have nerfed her a bit too much. So if you want to use this trait, stick to using it in the early game. And the last trait for the B tier is Redeemed. Much like Dawnbringer, Redeemed doesn't have much of a place in the late game meta, but it also doesn't really have much of a place in the early game either. So where is it valuable? Rel, for the most part, is what makes Redeemed worth anything. Of course, the majority of the time she isn't used with Redeemed, but she's the main reason why Vel'Koz is even remotely playable in the current meta. Alright, let's move on to the last tier, C tier. This tier consists of Legionnaire, Knight, Renewer, and Spellweaver. The synergies in the C tier are not as egregiously bad as they were in Reckoning. In the mid-set, this tier is for traits that are usable, but provide far less value than the tiers above them. Starting off, we have Legionnaire. Legionnaire took quite the hit in the mid-set when it lost Mordekaiser as a champion. Mordekaiser was the linchpin for a lot of comps, so without him, there's a noticeable void that hasn't quite been filled. Aurelia does help quite a bit by being a Legionnaire, but mostly for the early stages of the game. Later on, she doesn't really fit into a typical Legionnaire board, so you don't really see her paired with champions like Yasuo or Draven. The other issue of Legionnaire is that, while it's useful for Yasuo and Draven, it's not all that important. Plus, at most, you're using only 2 Legionnaires. We'll have to see how the meta develops further over the course of the mid-set, but for now, Legionnaire is definitely on the lower end of the tier list. Next, we have Knight. Knights just don't quite cut it as frontliners compared to Brawlers, Revenants, and Cavaliers. Early game, yes, they are useful as the block damage does matter. Past the early part of the game, well, they don't provide as much. That said, Galio was a great addition to the game and can be used as a late game frontliner, but generally you won't be using him with the Knight trait. Bottom line is that there's too many cooks in the kitchen, or in this case, too many frontline options in the frontline, which leaves the Knight trait as the odd one out. Okay, Renewers are being used in the meta between Heimerdinger, Ivern, the new champion Rakan, and Soraka, but, and this is the main reason as to why we have them so low, the trait doesn't do anything. At least 2 Renewers don't do anything. Once you have 4, yes, you will see some value from the health and mana regen, but 2 Renewers is such a small buff that you'll barely even notice it. So yes, you will see quite a few Renewers in the meta. Rakan does well with Sentinels, Soraka has her own reroll build, Ivern is a solid frontliner with Revenant, and Heimer is great late game. But none of the champions are doing well because of Renewer. And the last trait of the C tier is Spellweaver. Look, this trait isn't anywhere near as bad as Verdant was in Reckoning, so being last doesn't mean it's unplayable or never used. We do see it with Abomination, Draconic, and occasionally Vel'Koz. But, like Renewer, the trait itself isn't doing all that much. It's also much harder to fit in for Spellweaver with the removal of Victor, as he was a decent middle-of-the-road Spellweaver to use. Now you have to rely on either an Emblem or Ziggs. That's all we have for today's tier list video. Overall, the meta seems like it's in a healthy place after the small tweaks they've done in the hotfix and the B patch. It's quite impressive how good the meta is considering it's the first patch of the mid-set. Let us know what you think about the current meta in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.